Ethan Cross stood outside the bank with his hat in his hands, staring at the letter that could change everything. The paper trembled slightly, not because of the wind, but because of the words written on it. His family's ranch, the land his grandfather had built with his own two hands, was in danger of being taken away. The debts had piled up faster than Ethan could pay them, and the bank was losing patience. He walked inside and sat across from Mr. Perkins, the bank manager, hoping for some kind of mercy. Instead, Mr. Perkins folded his hands and looked at Ethan with a serious expression. "Son, I want to help you," Mr. Perkins said, "but the board wants proof that you are settled. A responsible man, with a family, a home, someone who is not going to walk away when things get hard. A married man gets more trust than a single one, especially in times like these." Ethan left the bank feeling more hopeless than before. He had no wife, no prospects, and certainly no time to find either. The harvest season was approaching, and every day mattered. That same afternoon, across town, Grace Bennett sat behind the counter of her father's old store, staring at a different kind of trouble. Her father had passed away only months earlier, and his will contained a strange condition. Grace could inherit the store, the only home she had left, only if she was married within 30 days. If not, everything would pass to her father's nephew, a distant cousin known more for his greed than his kindness. Grace had no desire to marry for real, not so soon, and not for reasons like this. But she loved the store too much to let it slip away without a fight. It was Mrs. Callahan, a kind old friend of both families, who brought the two of them together. She had heard about Ethan's troubles at the bank and Grace's troubles with the will, and she believed she had found the perfect solution. "You both need a marriage," Mrs. Callahan said simply, sitting the two of them down at her kitchen table. "Not a real one, just enough to satisfy the bank and the will. After that, you go your separate ways, no harm done." Ethan and Grace looked at each other for the first time, both sizing up the stranger sitting across from them. Grace was sharp-eyed and confident, clearly a woman who did not make decisions lightly. Ethan was tired but honest-looking, the kind of man who worked hard and did not waste words. "It would only be on paper," Grace said carefully. "No expectations, no real marriage, just business." "Agreed," Ethan replied. "I need the bank to trust me, nothing more. Once my ranch is safe, we can end it quietly." They spent the next hour discussing the details, setting clear rules between them. They would live under the same roof to keep up appearances, attend town events together when necessary, and present themselves as a happily married couple. But everything else, especially their hearts, would remain untouched by the arrangement. Within a week, the wedding was arranged, small and simple, held at the little church at the edge of town. Only a handful of guests attended, mostly out of curiosity rather than celebration. Grace wore a plain blue dress, and Ethan wore his best shirt, still slightly wrinkled from being folded in a drawer for years. As they stood before the preacher, reciting vows meant only for show, Ethan glanced over at Grace. She looked calm, focused, determined to get through the ceremony efficiently. But something about the way the afternoon light touched her face, or the quiet strength behind her eyes, caught Ethan off guard. When it came time to say his vows, his voice wavered slightly. Not from nerves about the arrangement, but from something else entirely, something he could not quite explain. A feeling stirred in his chest, small but unmistakable, whispering that this may not be as simple as either of them had planned. Grace noticed the pause in his voice, but before she could think too much of it, the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and the town began to clap. Neither of them knew yet just how complicated a fake marriage could truly become. The first night Ethan moved his belongings into the small room above Grace's store, the air between them felt stiff and careful, like two strangers sharing a space neither of them fully understood. Grace showed him around quickly, pointing out where he could sleep, reminding him firmly that the arrangement came with rules. "Separate rooms," she said, crossing her arms. "This is only for show, remember?" "I remember," Ethan said, setting his small bag down by the door. "You won't even notice I'm here." But keeping such a promise proved harder than either of them expected. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of hammering outside. She walked downstairs to find Ethan repairing the shop's creaky front door, something that had annoyed her for months but that she never had time to fix herself. You didn't have to do that, she said, surprised. Didn't want the whole town hearing that door every time someone walked in, Ethan replied simply, wiping sawdust from his hands. Besides, if we're supposed to be married, I figured I should act the part. Grace tried to hide her smile, but it slipped through anyway. As the days passed, small acts of kindness became part of their daily routine. Ethan carried heavy crates from the storeroom without being asked, saving Grace's back from the strain. In return, Grace began packing him lunch before he left for the ranch each morning, tucking in a note or two about things she thought he should know for the bank meetings. In the evenings, Grace helped Ethan understand bookkeeping, showing him how to organize his ranch's expenses neatly so the bank would see real effort and structure. Ethan, who had never been much for numbers, found himself grateful for her patience and more than a little impressed by her sharp mind. Their conversations, once short and businesslike, began to stretch longer. They sat together on the porch after supper, watching the sun go down, talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams they once had before responsibilities took over. Ethan learned that Grace loved reading old adventure novels her father used to bring home from traveling salesmen. Grace learned that Ethan had once dreamed of raising horses instead of cattle, though he never had the money to try. The town, meanwhile, grew fond of the newlyweds. Neighbors began inviting them to potlucks and church gatherings, admiring how well suited they seemed for one another. Mrs. Callahan, especially, took great pride in watching her matchmaking plan appear to succeed so beautifully, unaware that the two were only performing for everyone's benefit. Ethan found himself surprised by how easily he settled into the role. He complimented Grace's cooking, walked with her to the market, and even held her hand in public without being asked, simply because it felt natural rather than forced. Grace noticed too, catching herself glancing at him more often than she should, warmth rising in her chest whenever he smiled at her across a room. One quiet evening, after a town dinner where they had laughed together more than either expected, Ethan offered to walk Grace home beneath a sky full of stars. The night was calm, filled with crickets singing softly in the grass, and neither of them spoke for a while, simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. As they reached her doorstep, Ethan turned to her, something serious forming in his expression. "Grace, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice quieter than usual. Grace looked up at him, curious, her heart beating a little faster than she expected. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, the words sitting right at the edge of his lips. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might say something that would change everything between them, something far beyond the boundaries of their careful arrangement. But just as quickly, he caught himself, shaking his head and looking away. "Never mind," he said. "It's nothing. Good night, Grace." He turned and walked back toward the store before she could respond, leaving Grace standing alone on the porch, confused and strangely disappointed by his sudden silence. She stood there a while longer, staring at the door he had disappeared through, wondering what exactly he had almost said, and why her heart refused to settle down long after he was gone. As the weeks passed, Ethan found it harder and harder to remember why their marriage was supposed to be fake in the first place. He caught himself thinking about Grace while working the fields, wondering what she was doing at the store, whether she had eaten lunch, whether she would smile at him the way she always did when he came home in the evening. Grace, too, found herself changing. She noticed the small things Ethan did without thinking, how he always saved her the last piece of bread at supper, how he listened closely when she spoke instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk. She told herself repeatedly that these feelings were not part of the plan, yet her heart seemed to disagree more each day. But not everyone in town was as pleased with the marriage as Mrs. Callahan. Grace's cousin, Walter Bennett, had grown suspicious the moment he heard about the sudden wedding. Walter had always expected the store to fall into his hands once Grace failed to meet her father's condition, and the marriage threatened to ruin his plans completely. He began asking around town, questioning neighbors, hoping to find some crack in their story. "Seems awful sudden, don't it?" Walter said to the town blacksmith one afternoon. "A marriage arranged in just 1 week? Something don't sit right about that." Word of Walter's suspicions eventually reached Ethan and Grace, adding new pressure to their already complicated situation. At the same time, Mr. Perkins at the bank grew curious as well, noticing that Ethan and Grace never spoke of future plans together, no talk of children, No talk of expanding the ranch as a family. A real married couple, he thought, usually spoke of such things naturally. To keep their secret safe, Ethan and Grace found themselves forced to act even closer in public than before. At the next town social, Ethan held her hand a little longer than necessary while greeting neighbors. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder during a slow dance, more to appear convincing than out of habit, though her heart raced regardless. Once, caught beneath the shade of an old oak tree during a church picnic, their faces drew closer together, lips nearly touching, before a passing neighbor's laughter startled them apart. The pretending had become almost unbearable, blurring so completely with real emotion that neither of them could tell anymore where the act ended and truth began. One quiet evening, after the store had closed and the ranch work was finished, Grace found Ethan sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the darkening sky. She sat beside him, her heart pounding with a question she could no longer ignore. "Ethan," she said softly, "be honest with me. Does this still feel fake to you?" Ethan turned to look at her, caught completely off guard by the directness of her question. His mind raced, searching for the right words, torn between fear of ruining their fragile trust and the truth sitting heavy in his chest. "Grace, he started, his voice trembling slightly. Before he could finish, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. Walter Bennett stormed up the path toward the porch, the county clerk following closely behind him, papers clutched tightly in his hands. "Grace Bennett!" Walter announced loudly, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "I have proof right here that this marriage of yours was never even legal to begin with." Grace stood quickly, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. "What are you talking about, Walter?" The county clerk stepped forward, adjusting his glasses nervously. "I'm afraid there was an error at the courthouse," he said. "Some paperwork was never properly filed. Legally speaking, your marriage was never completed." Silence fell over the porch as the weight of his words settled in. Ethan looked at Grace, stunned, his heart still racing from the confession he had almost made only moments before. Walter crossed his arms, clearly pleased with himself. "Which means, dear cousin, the store is mine after all." Grace's eyes darted between Walter's smug expression and Ethan's shocked face, unsure which shock hit her harder, the threat to her inheritance or the unfinished words still hanging unspoken between her and the man she had begun falling for without even realizing it. For a long moment, nobody on the porch said a word. Walter Bennett stood with his arms crossed, grinning like a man who had already won. The county clerk shuffled his papers nervously, clearly uncomfortable being the bearer of such news. Grace stood frozen, her mind racing between the threat to her store and the words Ethan had almost spoken just moments before. "So you see," Walter said, breaking the silence, "there was never a real marriage at all, just some paperwork mistake and a whole lot of pretending for nothing. The store belongs to me now, exactly as my uncle's will intended." Grace opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. For the first time since this whole arrangement began, she felt truly lost. It was Ethan who moved first. He stood slowly from the porch steps, his eyes fixed on Grace rather than Walter, as though the smug cousin and the confused clerk were not even standing there. Something in his expression had changed, firm and certain, like a man who had finally stopped running from the truth. "Grace," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I need to say something, and I need to say it now, in front of everyone." Grace turned to him, her heart pounding. "These past weeks were supposed to be fake," Ethan continued. "A business arrangement, nothing more. But somewhere between fixing that door and sharing supper with you every night and watching you laugh at things I said, it stopped being fake for me. I don't know when it happened exactly. I just know that it did." Walter scoffed loudly, but Ethan ignored him completely, taking a step closer to Grace. "So I'm asking you now," Ethan said, "not because the bank needs it, and not because of any will. I'm asking you because I want to marry you, Grace Bennett, for real this time. No pretending, no rules, no separate rooms. Just us, choosing this because we want to." Grace felt tears rising in her eyes, though they were nothing like the fear she had felt only moments earlier. Every doubt she carried about her own feelings disappeared instantly, replaced with a clarity she had never felt before. "Yes," she said, without a single moment of hesitation. "Yes, Ethan, I want that too." Walter's triumphant smile collapsed into confusion and anger. "This changes nothing," he snapped. "The paperwork was never filed correctly. Legally, none of this counts." "Then we will file it correctly," Ethan said calmly, turning to the county clerk. "Right now, if you're willing to help us." The clerk, clearly moved by what he had just witnessed, nodded quickly, pulling fresh papers from his bag. "I would be glad to, Mr. Cross. In fact, it would be my honor." Realizing his plan had fallen apart completely, Walter stormed off the porch, muttering angrily under his breath, leaving empty-handed and thoroughly defeated. Word of what happened spread through town faster than any gossip before it. By the time Ethan and Grace walked into the bank the following morning, Mr. Perkins had already heard the whole story from at least 3 different neighbors, each version more emotional than the last. Mr. Perkins looked at the couple standing before him, hands clasped together, eyes only on each other rather than on the papers spread across his desk. "I have seen many marriages come through this bank," he said, smiling for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember. "But few built on such honesty. You could have walked away when the paperwork failed, Mr. Cross. Instead, you chose her, truly and completely. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." He approved Ethan's loan that same day, giving the ranch the second chance it needed to recover fully. That evening, Ethan and Grace stood together outside the small courthouse, the very place where their fake marriage had unraveled and their real one had begun. The sun was setting warmly behind them, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. "To think," Grace said, laughing quietly as she leaned against him, "our marriage started as something fake and somehow became the most real thing either of us has ever known." Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Guess some plans work out better than we ever expected." And as they walked home together, hand in hand, the whole town watching with quiet admiration, neither of them doubted for a single moment that whatever came next, they would face it together, for real this time.